Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is the fourth discussion in our series called Spark Change for Justice, Critical Conversations for Community-Led Change. Before we get started today, we like to start these series with a very brief moment of silence to recognize the suffering that has happened because of this pandemic. As of today, over 1.3 million people have died from COVID worldwide. So we're just going to take a brief moment of silence. Thank you. So Spark Change for Justice, Critical Conversations for Community-Led Change. This is our fall series. Following last spring, we did a series about issues related to COVID. We hope to continue this. Discussions in this series have really focused on racial justice and how the COVID-19 pandemic has both revealed and exacerbated oppressive systems harming communities of color. And this series also reveals and highlights the kind of extraordinary work that's happening in Brooklyn right now. We are grateful for the support of our generous sponsors, Cleary Gottlieb, Kirkland & Ellis, National Grid, Santander, and Take-Two Interactive Software, which allows us to bring you these conversations. And we're really very grateful for you to sign on to yet another Zoom. We know we're all done with Zoom, so thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. So today, we are a foundation. So today we are discussing the relationship between philanthropy and social change and explore how philanthropic organizations must build their work around an ethos of solidarity rather than charity. Joining us today is Abigail Disney, filmmaker, philanthropist, activist, and the Emmy-winning director of The Armor of Light. She's also the chair and co-founder of Level Forward, a new breed storytelling company focused on systemic change through creative excellence. The companies and stories that have been the most meaningful for Abigail are the ones which foster human understanding. She has executive produced and supported over 100 projects through Fork Films funding program and created the nonprofit Peace is Loud, which uses storytelling to advance social movements focusing on women's rights and gender justice. Thank you so much, Abigail. And Edgar Villanueva is a globally recognized expert on social justice philanthropy. Edgar serves as chair of the board of directors of Native Americans in Philanthropy, NDN Collective, and is a board member of the Andrews Family Fund, a national foundation that works to improve the outcomes of vulnerable youth. Edgar currently serves as the senior vice president at the Schott Foundation for Public Education, where he oversees grant investment and capacity building supports for education justice campaigns across the United States. Edgar is the award-winning author of Decolonizing Wealth, a best-selling book offering hopeful and compelling alternatives to the dynamics of colonization in the philanthropic and social finance sectors. Thank you, Edgar, for joining us. Before diving into the conversation, just a few words about Brooklyn Community Foundation. We were founded in 2009, and we are the first and only public foundation dedicated to New York City's largest borough. We are a bridge between donors and nonprofits to spark lasting social change for a fair and just Brooklyn. Everything we do, grant making, governance, advocacy, is rooted in our explicit commitment to racial justice. To date, we have granted more than $50 million to vital organizations working across our borough. Launched in early March, we believe we think maybe the second community foundation to do this. We launched the Brooklyn COVID-19 Response Fund, and it was a fund specifically focused on prioritizing BIPOC communities. In the first phase of the fund, thanks to the generosity of, and this is quite extraordinary, I think, 1,600 donors. And those are donations that range from $5, and they're all special, $5 to multiple hundreds of thousands. So thank you, Brooklyn. You really stepped up. And in those 16 weeks, we distributed $3.3 million to 420 grants. So this was really an all hands on deck response to COVID, which, as you know, hit Brooklyn especially hard. Grants included food and financial support for undocumented workers, domestic violence. We did not dictate where the response went. We allowed for people to tell us what their greatest needs were. The next phase of the fund is launching this fall with a community engagement project. Because again, we don't know what the emergencies are in this borough. So we're actually going back out into these communities, 10 hardest hit communities that are almost entirely Black and brown communities. And we are asking them, what are you facing now? And how can we help? I do want to just say one thing about the COVID fund. It is still very much up and running. We've raised over $4 million to date. We are here for the long haul. We all know this is happening for a long time. And we all know that Brooklyn, and especially populations, people of color in Brooklyn, are still being hit incredibly hard. So I would just say to everybody, please consider making a donation to our COVID fund. And I will leave you with this, which is that 100% of every dollar that is donated to us goes right back out to communities in Brooklyn. Finally, before I invite Abby and Edgar in to start chatting, there is a Q&A tab at the bottom. Please use that for your questions. We will answer your questions. There's going to be about 10 to 15 minutes at the end of this discussion where we'll do our best to get to your questions. So feel free to use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Also, we have closed caption. You can also see that at the bottom of your screen if you would like to use closed captions. Okay, well, welcome, Edgar and Abby. Thank you so much for joining us. As you know, in today's conversation, we want to explore about the harm that's done in the name of philanthropy and how that harm can be repaired by philanthropy. The relationship between philanthropy and social change, as we know, is often charged with inherently contradictory dynamics. Wealthy, powerful institutions funding movements led by grassroots organizations. Recognizing this imbalance is not enough. We believe philanthropic organizations must build their work around the ethos, as I said before, of solidarity and not charity. So I'm going to start with my first question to you both. What does philanthropy mean to you? And why does the institution of philanthropy need to change, if you think it does?
Do you want to pick a person to start?
No, you guys can.
Go ahead, Abigail.
Okay.
Yeah. All right, Abby, go.
Okay. Well, let's see. I started thinking about sharing my wealth in my 20s. It's not how I thought of it at the time. What I thought was, oh my God, icky, ew, I feel terrible. And so randomly, as randomly as reading an article in the New York Times, started sort of writing this check or that check. And when you do it that way, it pretty quickly becomes clear that you can't really make a difference that way. You can make tiny differences like pennies from heaven to some here and there, but like if you actually are committed to what other people need, you need to give it more thought than that. So that was sort of the beginning of how I found my way into this foundation and that foundation. And I feel so lucky because it could have gone a million ways. There were a whole bunch of different entities I volunteered for in those early days. But the one that made the real difference was the New York Women's Foundation, because the language that a lot of people are using now around like grassroots communities and how the people closest to the problems are the people you need to listen to for the answers, that's language you hear everywhere now as though it's always been said, but that is not what was being said at the time. And the New York Women's Foundation was kind of the only place taking those ideas seriously. And so it wasn't just that I found my way into a community of people who believed that power sharing was crucial, but that really wove it into the practice. I found that this was incredibly enriching. Whatever it was that had led me as an individual to want to fix the inequity that I found myself participating in was really fulfilled. So that's a long way around to saying that it is so very clear to me that philanthropy is empty, unfulfilling in a deep spiritual way to the individual engaged in it as a benefactor, unless there is solidarity. It's that quote that I now can't remember who said it, like, if you come to help me, never mind, but if you come because your well-being is in solidarity with mine, that I feel that everything I've had in my life that has been uplifting, everything that has made me a better, deeper person, everything that has made me feel of use on this planet, I have gotten because I made the decision to live in solidarity as an equal and a peer instead of in the clouds as a benefactor and a donor.
Edgar?
Thank you. So when I think about what philanthropy means to me, I often talk about my mother because she was the first philanthropist that I knew, and I'm such a mama's boy. And also, let me just say, quick side note, I'm really happy to be here and doing this program with my hometown community foundation. I live in Brooklyn, and so this is really an honor just to be with my people today. But yeah, my mother was, we didn't have wealth, but my mom was very oriented to community. And I spent a good bit of my childhood going into the community all the time with my mom. And she was, my mom had a passion for young people, and this was connected to community work through her church. And so that was kind of all I knew growing up, is like, we got to go out and visit kids and let the neighborhood kids know we love them and make sure everybody has what they need. And so much to the point where I didn't even realize how poor we really were, at the time. And so that for me, philanthropy is definitely about moving money, but philanthropy goes back to ideas of generosity and our time and our talent. And, the word actually means love of people, right? And so when I think about what institutional philanthropy needs to change, I feel like as we become so institutionalized as a sector, we've kind of lost the love of people. We've institutionalized lovelessness. And we are centered so much on accumulating more wealth and building up our endowments and having our theories of change, and have lost touch with people in community in a lot of ways. And so that's why, ultimately what I think needs to change, I could talk about that all day long, but just a couple quick things is I think that we as a sector have to own up to our origin story and just name the contradictions that are what they are, right? Like the origins of this wealth, how communities have been harmed in this wealth. Whose wealth is it after all, right? And for me, fundamentally, the ownership of the wealth is a key thing to understand, because if we see wealth as being wealth that is owned by community, we will deploy those resources to community. But if we see wealth as something being owned by us or our endowments or our money, then we're going to hoard that wealth and not share the decision making power with communities. So it's the idea of ownership within institutional philanthropy that definitely needs to change. And that shows up in a lot of symptoms. We can get into diversity. We can look at how philanthropy has harmed communities. We can look at investments and endowments that are misaligned with the mission of organizations that are, in fact, harming communities. We can look at the unjust fact that only 8 to 10% of philanthropic gifts are made to communities of color, right? So all of that, I think, are symptoms of how the sector has institutionalized, lovelessness and centered wealth and money over people and community.
I love a conversation where the words love and spiritual, you said spiritual, Abby, and you said love, Edgar, and I appreciate that, because I think there are these really elevated values that have been lost, and I think it's so key. And I love what you both said. I do have to brag about Brooklyn Community Foundation that 75% of our grants go to POC-led organizations, and it's just a great. It's at least one thing to track and to be focused on and intent about. That's not it, by the way, that's not, it happened by chance. That's also by intent. And I do think that ownership, the concept of ownership, of course, is the keystone of capitalism, right? Capital, right? And so I think that's this kind of inherent contradiction, but you're right, it does belong to communities. So we're in the middle of a crisis. Well, we're in the middle of a lot of crises, actually, but let's, in terms of COVID, I'm just curious what that has made either of you think about philanthropy, what this crisis has meant to you in terms of philanthropy. And is there something about 2020, aside from 9 days ago, that has given you hope? Whether about philanthropy or in general, but.
Well, early on, I was hopeful that there would be this huge unmasking of this dirty secret about essential workers and who was really essential and what really mattered. And I love what you said, Edgar, about love, because it's not just that we don't use it; we've made the word seem stupid. In boardrooms and in conversations about what we call serious things. And I had hoped there would be this massive cultural reexamination of our values, yada, yada, yada. But then, look what happened. The stock market continued to climb. Jeff Bezos got richer and richer. And they didn't, there was an unmasking of something they already knew. And they were fine with it. I keep thinking that this is a typical mistake that liberals make, right? That once they know, then surely they will stop doing this bad thing. You don't want to believe that there are these really bad people. And so I did lose hope at that point. But of course, when the marches and the protests started, there was just an energy in the air that I hadn't seen in my lifetime, really. It was a better energy. I was young, but in the late 60s, everybody was out, and there was just real power in the idea of what people could accomplish. But this was so much better in energy, because this was really on the streets. You saw people taking charge who'd historically been forced not to be in charge, and a recognition on the part of many white allies that, my place is not at the front of this line. I am not in charge of saving anyone. I am here as an ally. Those were all incredibly important psychic and mental shifts that I think needed to happen. And those things made me hopeful if we can hold on to them, especially in the progressive and liberal spaces where we have really honestly not promoted that kind of thinking. we have tended to shower recognition on the person in most prominence, and it has been easy to shove your way into prominence with the color of your skin, with the positioning of your name or your voice. I know, because I'm well aware of it myself. I try to manage myself. So that's made me more hopeful than I've been in my life, watching the way young people have gathered and organized themselves. And, you know, many people say, I locate the beginning of this summer in Occupy Wall Street. And I've had many people older, 50 and up, say to me, oh, that was a failure. That movement was a failure. And I keep saying, what are you talking about? Like, this was the crucible in which so much of what we saw this summer was formed. And I know, like, as a funder, there was a massive proliferation of organizations that foregrounded activism, advocacy, action. And, you know, those were hard things to get funding for because you couldn't measure them. You couldn't guarantee any kind of impact. There was risk involved. You might even be saying some things that your donors find dangerous. I mean, they were incredibly difficult to fund, but I saw a whole generation of young men and women, and especially people of color and immigrants. And I saw them step into this incredible leadership, and I saw them then turn around and start nurturing young people. And those young people are now kind of like a second generation of powerful activists who are very committed to this idea of non-centralized power, non-hierarchical systems, and understanding what it is to put to turn the objects into subjects, and to ensure that the way you understand the flow of power and change is fundamentally different. That it doesn't originate with you. What all you are is a midwife, so that has made me hopeful. I think there has been a serious mindset shift, which is really, try saying that 3 times really fast. And I think it will color so much of what we do going forward. I am discouraged that at the highest levels in philanthropy, with some exceptions, obviously, there's a resistance still to this, and there is an inability that inability to deeply self-examine, to see the thing that's threatening to your understanding about things, to see the ways in which maybe you haven't always been as constructive as you need to be, and to be gracious about that, and to be willing to learn and willing to be vulnerable enough to change. That still is a sticking point for a lot of philanthropy, but we need to just keep hammering away at it. I feel we're in motion toward genuine change.
I do think there's, Edgar, I'm going to let you answer too, but I mean, a lot of what you're talking about is activism and organizing, and God, if we didn't have proof that organizing works from last week, what else was there, right? And these were young people of color, women of color, Black women organizing, and it works, you know? And you would think that that would be a great lesson to philanthropy, but Edgar, I'm sure you probably know the statistic. I mean, if philanthropy only funds 8 to 10% POC-led organizations, I can't even imagine what the percentage is for funding organizing. And yet the only way we've ever seen structural change actually shift is through organizing. So Abby, thank you for bringing that up, because I couldn't agree more. Edgar, 2020 for you and COVID. Are we having a technical difficulty?
Uh-oh.
Will not let.
There we go.
Oh, there. Okay.
All right.
I was hoping you were going to have to do it in interpretive dance.
I mean, yeah, if I didn't have on my pajama bottoms, then, you know, but, you know, oh God, 2020, I'm still learning so much from this year, and I pray to God that we learn the lessons that the universe has for us to learn so that we can get out of this mess and move forward. But I'm Native American. I'm enrolled in a tribe in North Carolina where I'm originally from, called the Lumbee tribe. And with COVID, with the economic fallout, with the uprisings for racial justice, I mean, all of these things are deeply connected, right? And I was hyper aware of how the pandemic was hammering Native communities. When the pandemic first started hitting the U.S., it was sort of Seattle, and then New York was kind of, if y'all can remember that far back, it seems like 5 years ago, right? And so some Native leaders immediately reached out to me and said, community is coming to us for, medication, rent, PP, like all the things, right? So I launched a COVID response fund myself, and we raised $3 million and funded about 90 Native-led organizations across the U.S. Of course, when the pandemic shifted toward the Southwest, the Navajo tribe, and at one point in time, all of the hot spots in the U.S. were tribal communities, we shifted our support there. First of all, it scared the crap out of me, because we all have so much to lose with COVID, but in my communities, where some communities are so small and we have so few elders left that speak the language, we were at threat of losing entire nations potentially with this thing, right? And we've been here before as Native folks. So I felt a deep sense of responsibility to use my privilege and the proximity and philanthropy to move resources to those communities. I was deeply inspired by the mutual aid funds that I saw popping up, like the one at Brooklyn Community Foundation, like the young woman in the Navajo tribe, Cassandra Abigail, who I'm going to have on a program later this week with our Giving Circle, who raised $3 million on GoFundMe. There's this understanding that I think we all have, that we can't wait on big philanthropy. We can't wait on the federal government, who stalled like heck to get resources out to our communities. There was so much politics in there around like different types of tribal recognition, whether or not you got money or not. We had to take care of ourselves. And this is something that I think people who have lived in the margins just know and understand. Like, we're thankful when support comes in, but we are prepared to take care of ourselves. And what happened in this pandemic was just all types of beautiful local grassroots community responses. And, I think big philanthropy is lucky if they got to fund some of that work, because it was just so beautiful. I am also hopeful and prayerful that this moment put us all back into some deep connection to our humanity, regardless of where we sit in terms of our income status, our race or ethnicity. I feel like there was a shared exhaustion, a shared anxiety and fear. This pandemic touched almost everyone, that I think helped to fuel, in a way, our response in philanthropy. Because folks who or sitting around boards of foundations, they were also impacted, right? If their kids were out of school, we were we got to get out of it. We're in this together, and we got to get out together. And I think that's solidarity, right? That sense of solidarity, that sense of all my relations, really helps to open the door to give in a way that is responsive to community. Like Abby said, it is disheartening to see how some folks profited off of this, this pandemic, and and are continuing to be problematic in a lot of ways in terms of how they use their wealth. But again, it goes back to that point that we first and foremost know how to take care of ourselves, and that's what we've got to do. We cannot rely. And so I think what I'm doing in my work, and others we're building our own philanthropic infrastructure. We don't have the wealth, but we have the relationships, and we have the connections that we need to move those resources, because we can't sit around and wait for the next disaster and rely on a government or a large foundation who's not going to show up for us.
I just actually I think it's interesting to use the term big philanthropy, which we are not decidedly, but I think actually research shows that the Black community in the United States is the most philanthropic community in the country in terms of per capita giving to their community. A lot of that may or may not be through churches. I don't want to make any assumptions, but I do think, Edgar, what you were touching on in terms of how we could look at structures around philanthropy, which is it doesn't have to be about ownership, and it doesn't have to be about large wealth. It really can be about love and about shared humanity in your own community. And what could be big philanthropies take away from that, right? That a Native American tribe in North Carolina can raise $3 million. There's a lesson in that. And it absolutely is about community. It absolutely is about shared humanity, and about love, and about spirituality, right? And how that can somehow replicate itself from big philanthropy. I mean, I would like to see a large scale handoff in some way, but I just think I love the example that you brought up there. Edgar, another question for you, which is the role of, well, this is connected, segue, reparations in philanthropy and the importance of addressing the racial wealth gap.
Oh, I love that question. It's like my favorite thing to talk about, so I'll try to be brief.
We want to know. We want to hear.
Well, what I'll say, reparations is triggers folks for some reason with that word, and like to me, it's a beautiful word. It means repair, and the world is broken. There's so much pain, and I am so attracted to anything that's about healing or repairing or reconciliation. I want us all to be well and thrive and to move forward. And so I think that philanthropy has such a cool opportunity to think about reparations because we move money, right? And ultimately, what has happened historically in the US and so many other places with colonization, with genocide, with the taking of land, with slavery, was deeply connected with accumulating money and building wealth, right? And so here we sit as philanthropists who have access to that wealth. How can we not give or move money in a way that doesn't respect that history? How can we not think about, wow, this wealth has been built on the backs of people of color? Or think about the role that people of color have played to create this bounty that we have in the US and not want to share that, or to ensure that those communities have more than enough. So that for me is really what reparations is all about. It's really acknowledging what has really happened either in philanthropy or in the nation, and then allocating resources in a way we can't undo colonization, we can't undo slavery. We'll never be able to completely repair those wounds, but we can definitely use our resources in a way that honors what has happened, and that are in service of repairing what has happened. I'm really inspired in Canada. There's work that's happening there that I think we can learn from in the US. Canada had a process of truth and reconciliation, right? A decade long, where the stories and the grievances of First Nations people were publicly documented. And as a result of that, there's a more heightened awareness in Canada about issues of race than in the US, I would say. And the philanthropic community there took that report from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and said, this is what people said they need to heal. This is what people need to recover. Let's fund that. Let's fund what they said they wanted and needed. And so I do think in the US, as we're thinking about reparations and moving resources back into communities, we have to also think about that process of what truth and reconciliation looks like. Because as much as I support the idea of reparations, I do fear that if we had a federal program, we threw some money at Black folks, we threw some money at Indigenous communities without doing that work, that process of healing, the process of truth telling and documenting, and then we will be doing ourselves a disservice in order to get to a place of true healing. Because what's actually happening in the United States is that history is being rewritten, it's being erased. My sister, Crystal Echohawk at Illuma Native, put out research that shows that in 27 27 states in America, make no mention of Native Americans in K-12 history curriculum, right? Which is like crazy, right? So there is an active erasure and rewriting of our history. And I think because we have failed to come to terms with our reality here and to deal with those original sins and that pain, we sweep it under the carpet. It's just festering there and we're not getting better. And we're seeing, white supremacy like rear its ugly head in all kinds of crazy, like in like just terrible, violent ways. And so that work of reparations is about moving money back in a way that honors and respects the communities from which it was taken. And it's also about a process of truth telling, documenting the stories, remembering and grieving. And so it is a dark place. It is a heavy place that we have to go into, I think, together as a country, but I believe it's necessary to get to a place of true healing.
I just want to take a moment. I just completely agree. And I think it's really profound. And I agree. It's reminding me that 1619 was such extraordinary podcast and got a lot of deserved attention. And if anybody here has not listened to 1619, do it the first thing chance you have. And so understandably, a lot of school districts were like, wow, first of all, who knew because of our lack of education, but we'd like to incorporate 1619 into our curriculum. And then the current administration, federal administration, Betsy DeVos, said, no, that would not be allowed. And for example, federal agencies would not be allowed to teach anything around 1619 or racial justice work. And very, very active silencing, just what you're talking about. And of course, there's so much silencing that is not quite so conspicuous, but just as insidious. So I just think whatever you said, everything you just said was great. Abby, a new administration, there is some hope here. And I'm just curious, as a philanthropist, are there policy changes? I picture you, Abby, like if there were lobbying in Washington, there's Abby and maybe, 5 of her friends. And then there's all of the other philanthropists who don't want any of these laws to change. But just are there ways to fix philanthropy from a policy standpoint, from this kind of macro federal standpoint, taxation or otherwise?
I've had a few things to say about that in the last year. And I've had a lot of pushback from my friends in big philanthropy. They don't like the idea of larger payouts. They don't like the idea of being forced, to expand on what they're giving, or, philanthropy's gotten all woven together with the neoliberal narrative about how, we're just as individuals, all entrepreneurs making our own way, and then it all works out because the invisible hand steps in and everything is fine. So a lot of this free market ideology has kind of penetrated our space in a way that's really damaging. And it doesn't make it's not confusing why that's happened. I mean, the money came from capitalists who were working in this fundamentalist capitalist understanding of how things happening. And so, and what I saw in the 90s happen, it hasn't really been written about, and it needs to be, because when I came to this in the 80s, it was sort of still this old polite world of nice old white men in suits and who, kind of made deals with each other with handshakes, and everybody was just nice and polite. And then along came the hedge fund folks, and along came the tech folks. And, when John Rockefeller started his foundation, he was an old man, and he might've done some shitty things, but he had the benefit at least of age and some calm and some sense that, like, we need to really think this through. And the problem with the tech and the hedge fund folks is they have all of the arrogance of youth. And none of the wisdom of age. And so they really came in with a lot of this, I went to Harvard Business School, and therefore let me tell you how to run your community bank. And a lot of this kind of like, let me send one of my Harvard people or McKinsey people out to your little community-based organization. They'll just get you running right. And what happened was this devolution of what we did into this, can you measure it? How much will it cost? Tell me the cost per capita. Tell me how fast it's going to happen. And we're at a point where we need to do everything slowly, with more money, and take more people. I mean, every direction we've moved in, we now need to reverse. I love what you said, Edgar, about reconciliation. I've done some work over the years in the international peace building space. And so reconciliation is a word that gets batted around a lot. And you go to spaces like Bosnia and parts of South Africa, across the Congo, where you can really feel that an inattention to reconciliation is going to come back and bite everybody in the rear end pretty quickly. And when you travel enough around the world into conflict and post-conflict countries, and then you come back to the United States and look at the political dynamics here, you realize that this is what happens when there's never been reconciliation. I mean, we have had a sore festering in this country, and not since the Civil War, but since 1619. And we have let it fester. And the thing is, the worse it gets and the further you get from the crime, the more deeply invested people are in their narratives of how they've been victimized and they need, you get further from being able to accomplish anything. It takes a lot of moral courage to even talk about reconciliation. And I've never been in a setting where I've seen it actually accomplished. Because the hardest thing in the world is to get the privileged people to recognize that while something might not be particularly your fault, it may still be your responsibility. So we have a lot of work to do in philanthropy, and it's going to have to be in a great measure spiritual. But there will also have to be legislation as well. We look, I put my money into a foundation, then I took the tax break. When you take that tax break, you are saying, I am benefiting the larger society in some kind of way, which is why it's willing to acknowledge that by giving me a tax break. I don't own this money anymore. The world owns this money. And it would be completely wrong for me to make all the decisions, especially based on, how I got out of bed this morning or what I read yesterday in the Times, about how it needs to do the best and finest work. And so we really need to figure out a way to talk about opening our processes up to greater transparency. My God, is there a less transparent sector?
Yep.
We need to remind boards of not-for-profits that they work for the taxpayers, and not for donors, and not for foundations, and that foundations work for taxpayers. They work for taxpayers. And then we need to kind of try and enforce that in some kind of important way. Like the sweetheart, where the real money is in philanthropy, and the obtuseness that just seems to never go away. I mean, I'm not going to name names, but I'm going to give $20 million to African women because African women are great. And then it kind of all stays with white academic women in the Midwest of the United States. I mean, I don't even know where to start with that. So there's just this persistent level of emotional stupidity and spiritual stupidity. I know I'm not talking about policy right now. Here, I'll talk about policy. Wealth tax right now. Yesterday. I don't know what the threshold is. I don't know what the number is. Let's talk about that.
Okay.
But people who have constructed vast sums of money on the backs of workers who have been working at poverty wages and worse for decades, they need to pay the piper. It is time. Now, I am happy to pay a wealth tax. And there is more than enough need in education, in infrastructure, in job development, and all these things that need to happen that are fundamental to us. I would start with a wealth tax.
Hear, hear. All right, we have gotten lots of good questions. So I'm going to skip our last couple of questions so that the audience can have an opportunity to engage with you. And I apologize because I'm not very good at this. But let me see. Okay. So I had mentioned earlier that 100% of every dollar that gets given to us then goes back out to the community, which is a true statement by Brooklyn Community Foundation. But this woman is asking, and I think it's a great question, does that kind of undermine the reality and the necessity of absolutely paying for things that just have to sustain an organization, and really what goes on, what's the labor behind the organization? So I'd love to hear the two of you from a philanthropic standpoint. I do want to say about BCF, just to answer that question, we are really fortunate that we came out of a bank. And so we had a corpus that actually pays for our behind the scenes, if you will. And that's why I can say that 100% of every dollar. But I do also want to say that in our grant making, we give 100% general operating support. So even if it was the COVID response fund, it was still going to GOS. So if you need to spend it on the lighting bill, we're good. And that is pretty much across all of our programs. We give multi-year general operating support, and I would encourage any donor or philanthropist on this, in this audience, to do the same. But Edgar and Abby, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, hooray for the general operating support. There's nothing more insulting and patronizing and paternalistic than telling people that they don't need a file cabinet when they need a file cabinet. And I've been in offices of not-for-profits around the city where they're propping up desks because one leg is broken with the books from last year and so on. It's just, and I will say this, this tendency not to want to fund general operating came, again, from everything that's wrong with philanthropy right now. Because again, we wedded it to this neoliberal idea of like constantly improving our efficiency. Like, how do we squeeze more out of this dollar? And always, you know, the MBAs want you to think they're the most rational, logical people in the world. But let's all remember that they believe in an invisible hand, and what's more magical thinking than the invisible hand? But they also don't apply their own language and thinking and rationale to what they're doing. If you were to look at the sector as a capitalist, you would say, what is the asset? If I were going to sell this whole thing, what would be the asset I was selling? Because it's not a building, you know, and it's not a lot of hardware, and it's not even really a lot of ideas. It's people. Basically, the only thing of value in this entire sector is people. And what the McKinsey-led and the MBA-led charge toward constantly applying this business framework to understanding the job, what it primarily pushed down on was people's salaries and people's time and people's benefits. And it's like running a Ferrari with no oil in the tank. You know, you can't consistently drive people to become, you know, potentially one paycheck away from being their own clients, and expect it to be sustainable. So the first thing that needed to happen was, as you said, general operating support grants, and a recognition that actually people are quite expensive. You really do, if you're an employer, have to take full responsibility for things like their retirement planning, for them having enough money to get back and forth to their homes, which are in good order, and you know that they can get their children to and from school. And all of these very basic things need to be provided for. And if you as a capitalist recognize that your stock price is always going to go up, and the asset that you own will always go up, then you have to recognize that that number, which gets your person to a living, dignified life, is also always going to go up. Not down, but up. So in fact, the MBA mentality drove us to the reverse of what would build a strong sector. And so we kind of need to do the work of reframing and taking this business language out. You know, yes, it was an inefficient sector. Yes, it made a lot of silly decisions. I think it's made more silly decisions as you know, promoters of this invisible hand thing than it ever did. And if you took all the money, you know, philanthropy spent, for instance, in a place like the Republic of Congo over the last 20 years, and just put it in one pot and divided it up and handed it out in cash to every citizen of Congo, I guarantee you would have had a far better outcome right at this moment than we could possibly have had with every good intention that got frittered away without accountability. across not just this country, but around the world. I forgot your question, but that, anyway.
The question was kind of making sure to fund behind the scenes, that this idea of just like, oh, it's the perfect little program, that kind of thing. And it was an apt response to just what I said, that our money goes out that particular way. But I think you're exactly right. We're talking about, it's love of man, philanthropy, right? Love of people. So if it's really love of people, make sure that they're living, they have a living wage. Edgar, anything do you want to add to that?
I think, well, I will say that in general, community foundations and public kind of funds do better with this, right? Because there is that transparency and accountability to donors and to the community. And so I think it's fantastic that Brooklyn Community Foundation is in a position to have the operations budget covered to focus on moving that money. We do the same thing with my fund. Once we're covered in terms of what we need to keep the lights on, we move the money directly out. When we need to raise money for our operations, that's a different conversation. So it's really about being transparent and showing how we're using our resources as philanthropic organizations to continue to have that trust with donors. Where the question marks come up for me will be, what's going on with private philanthropy, where we have very little transparency and accountability. Of course, donor advised funds also, in many cases, don't have those same types of restrictions or accountability, depending on how they're structured and who's being the steward of those donor advised funds. And so I think when we look at foundations paying out only the minimum, and including their administrative costs somehow in that as a charitable deduction, those are people who are working the system. And it gets back to how we kind of started here with like, what really matters, moving the money to the community or keeping those resources inside to build our own wealth.
Can I say one more thing?
Of course.
I've had a little bit of an inside look into the way right-wing organizations handle themselves as philanthropists. And one of the reasons they've been powerful, disproportionate to the resources they have at their disposal. Yes, there are very wealthy people, the Mercers and others, who grant a lot of money. But we have a lot of resources at our disposal, and we have never gotten politically the same bang for our buck, even close. And that's because, well, first of all, they're not needing to feed the hungry, because that's just not what they do. So they
don't care.
Money they don't spend on that. But they fund people for general operating support as a matter of course. That's all they do. They're just like, what do you need? Here it is. Here's a check that's twice the size of the one that I intended to give you. They pay people well. They make sure they have retirement funds. They make sure people have enough money and they have housing and the rest of it. I mean, mind you, they do this in part to control people. And that's obviously not a direction we want to go in. But the right wing has never wasted its time on nickel and diming anyone. They don't ask for reports. They don't ask you to jump through hoops. And they are, as a result, far more effective.
Ooh, that's a little haunting, huh?
Yeah.
Abby, a question for you. I'm just going to read it. I'm a Latina fundraiser who primarily works with individual major donors, many of whom are older white people. I believe in a community-centric fundraising approach. However, I think white fragility might not be receptive to anything but the traditional donor-centric approach. Do you have any advice on how to have more honest conversations with donors without risking funding? Unfortunately, white philanthropists need to know that BIPOC nonprofit staff are often code switching when we interact with them, because that's the game. It doesn't feel good.
Yeah, it feels.
Thank you for the question.
Yeah, thank you for that question, because I hate the way things are at this moment, and white fragility is, a massive barrier to a lot of really important things happening. And it's very real, and it's very pervasive. So I actually think you maybe need to give up on your principle about community-led fundraising, just the tiniest bit, and bring in a peer, and I'm happy to help if I can find the time. I'm happy to help with this kind of thing, because I like to talk to other donors a lot, because they can hear it from a peer. in a way that they can't hear it. And this is actually true across the board. It's true for people of color as well. They don't want to hear from me about something that they understand themselves. So this is a natural human tendency to want to hear the hard things from people who share your experience. And I don't think that's a barrier to donor-led, to community-led fundraising. I think it's just recognizing a reality. If you can find an effective peer who will come and arm in arm with you, sit and help people with the fragility part, they can get past it. But right now, there is such a critical mass of white fragility, and it is so on high alert that I think it's just too hard for wealthy people to hear it. I mean, wealthy people actually think that people are going to come and start with guillotines and pitchforks. I mean, that is the conversation they're actually having. They are so freaking scared. And it makes me laugh because of the people I know in this world. It's the last thing that's going to happen. But they're really honestly hiring security and getting bulletproof cars and moving further and further away from cities because they actually think this is just getting ready to happen. So unfortunately, we're going to have to recognize that there's a lot of stupidity and obtuseness, and we're going to have to deal with it in a Machiavellian kind of way.
So here's a good question. Edgar, maybe I'll start with you on this. How can philanthropy reimagine how we measure impact? Actually, both of you can take this. Impact. I mean, and I think that really goes to, you've both kind of touched on that. I don't know that that specific word has been used, but it is that kind of MBA, if you will, kind of MBA mentality, which is of course capitalism. So how can we measure impact, especially for nuanced missions such as ending anti-Blackness and racial inequity that history tells us will take decades to dismantle? Mm-hmm. So what can philanthropy do to, help that along?
Edgar, you're welcome.
I just want to like throw it all out. Like it's so exhausting. And I've been, I've worked at large foundations. I've been doing this, as I said, 16 years. And there's just so much that is made up that, nonprofits are being forced to like fabricate and make up stuff because of our ridiculous questions. And then foundations are, often moving through the world with in a way that's disillusioned, like taking so much credit for things. I remember one of the first times I really I was working at a health foundation, very young, and we were funding smoking cessation programs, right? And I just remember we were like taking credit for, and the irony in this was with like tobacco money, right? I worked for the Reynolds family who made their money off of cigarettes. I'm funding smoking cessation programs. That's a whole nother conversation. We were just taking so much credit for like people stopping smoking, where we know that without our grant, a certain number of people would have just stopped smoking anyway, right? And so that's just a small example where we feel as funders often that we have to carve out like some specific thing that we take credit for, where the reality is organizations are getting funding from so many different resources. I always kind of sit back every time there's a victory in community, maybe like what we've just experienced with Georgia, and start seeing the statements come out where every foundation's like, they did it, right? And it's like, no, they receive funding from lots of people, and it's not about you, it's about the people doing the work. So I just think that, I'm not against like impact, but I think that it comes from this place of us as funders needing to be relevant, to feel like we're actually making a difference or controlling something. And I'm just not into that. I'm perfectly like happy knowing that I just moved X amount of money to these people. And that's the only thing I need to know. I don't need to go back and police them. We even have these program officer kind of titles that are right? We are like policing people that we don't trust that they're doing what they said they're doing with the money, and we need them to prove it. And it's just a really antiquated type of thing. Like either we believe in the work, we believe in the leaders, and we move the money, and kind of let it go and do it, like get into a relationship with folks. I do appreciate about my work at the Schott Foundation, we're pretty small. And so we don't have like rigorous evaluation expectations or anything. And we fund movement work, and most of the I'm like, I follow my grantees on social media. I see what they're doing. I see they're showing up. They're having this action. They're pushing this thing. They're advocating for that. It's like a real time thing. So why do they need to like go and write all that up for me? Like I see it happening. I'm good. So I think so. It comes from it just comes from I think an insecurity and a need to be relevant. And a need to take credit and again, like it's all about us and not about community. So it needs to be interrogated in a lot of ways, in my opinion.
So here you sell a lot of buzzwords that, like, if you're a feminist like me, all you're thinking is patriarchy, right? I can't help myself. I'm sorry, but sure. What is it that high school boys walk into every locker room in the world and get obsessed with measuring? So this measurement obsession actually is very gendered. It's very gendered, and it's about control. It's about the things that we call efficiency and effectiveness and impact and all of this kind of thing. But really, it's an avoidance mechanism for engaging with the things that really need to happen. And what I like to say to the big not-for-profits is, I want you to go look at the way your process works and ask yourself, if Mahatma Gandhi walked in here tomorrow, would you fund him? Because probably not Martin Luther King either. I doubt Abraham Lincoln would get money out of you people. So what you're betting on, because it is a bet, it is a risk, and we should bear the risk as the people with the greater access to resources, first of all. What we are betting on when we write that check is the people that we have been in relationship with while we are deciding whether or not to write that check. What is it, the program about? What is it going to do? So these are important words here: relationship, human beings. In the 90s, as tax laws were changing and the Glass-Steagall Act was changing and greed was suddenly good. I mean, a lot of things were happening culturally, and they were happening to a large extent on purpose. And you should all read Kurt Anderson's brilliant book, Evil Geniuses. It really is amazing. One of the things that also happened is that greed is good mentality, or it doesn't matter if it can't be measured. If it can't be measured, it doesn't matter. Seeped into our boardrooms, seeped into our processes. We got language like officers, we got language like impact, which are kind of like crypto violent words. And what dripped out of everything was the idea that this was fundamentally a question of relationships. And that's when, by the way, ongoing support also disappeared. You had 2 years and you were done. Go find somebody else. We don't want you to develop a dependency on us. Dependency is the nature of the thing. So just there was a lot of, again, magical thinking that was wearing a disguise as rationality, while everything human, like love, like generosity, like bearing responsibility that maybe the law doesn't require you to bear. All of these things got sucked, like, there was a Dracula sucking all the good stuff out. So we need to, transfuse a lot of blood let back into our, dry and lifeless, corpse of philanthropy and return it to a state of relationship. Now, back in John Rockefeller's days, the relationships were primarily and only among white men, about white men and for white men. And when they did fund people who were poor, it was really to keep them quiet so we could get on with the process of milking the economy for everything we could. So like, we've learned a lot about relationships in the time since then. We are a different culture now. So let's return to a sense of relationship with all that we now understand and see what we can do now.
I think one word that's incredibly lovely. I think one word that Edgar and Abby, you both really touched on at the end here that just wasn't uttered, but you were essentially saying it is about trust, right? So do you have to measure, right?
Yeah.
Do you have to? You're watching them on social media, Yahoo, but even if you weren't, you're like, I know they're down. I know they're doing what they said they were doing. And what bigger pillar is there in relationships and of love, right? And I know even now trust philanthropy, philanthropy loves jargon. Trust philanthropy is now, of course, a buzz. But if you really look at just really how meaningful that is, right? Is that going to be a flip? Is that going to be a structural flip for philanthropy? So we are very much at time. The audience is loving you. I've just been watching wonderful comments go by. You're both just phenomenal. It really gives me hope. And I guess if there's just any last thing you want to say, otherwise we're going to call it. And actually, before you say your last thing, I just want to let the audience know that our last webinar of the Spark Justice series is called Say Her Name. And it's on December 8th at 2:30. And it's with award-winning author and social justice scholar Monique Morris and Joanne Smith, who's founder and CEO of Girls for Gender Equity, one of our grantees. They will be discussing the impacts of misogynoir on the ongoing fight to achieve gender justice, equity, and liberation for Black women. Don't miss it. It's our last one of this series. It's going to be phenomenal. Joanne is great, and Monique is the second time Monique's come back to the foundation to speak with us. So I highly recommend it. If you've forgotten everything I just said, it is on our website, as are recordings of all the webinars. So if you said, you got to hear Abby and Edgar later, this will be recorded. This will also be on the website. Edgar and Abby, anything to say in closing? And thank you so much.
So my last thing is really just going to be about your last thing, which is that I've been working around women's philanthropy and community-based philanthropy for a really long time. If you're a white woman and you're listening to this, make an effort, as big an effort as you just made to get to this one, to go to the next one. It may feel like it has nothing to do with you, but it has everything to do with you. And we voted, a larger majority of us, for Trump this time. So something is up with us. We need to go in humility and with love in our hearts and hear what people are saying and be open to it. And then if you're a man, white or not, you need to make the effort to go too. I have been in too many rooms where there are just no men. And none of this is going to change unless you join with us. It doesn't make you less masculine. It doesn't make you less important. We need you. And we need you to come with humility and love in your heart and a willingness not to be the center of attention, and listen and learn. So please try to attend this next webinar, because it will be some of the most important thing you'll hear this year.
Thank you, Abby. Edgar, anything?
Thank you, Abby. I love how you always call in white folks. I appreciate that. I would just say that we are experiencing such a unique moment right now. And there's a window in front of us that we have got to push like we've never pushed. And I really appreciate how folks have responded to support COVID. I really appreciate how folks are responding to support the movement for Black lives, Indigenous organizing, investing money in communities of color. But we cannot, on the other side of this election, feel like we've done our job and we're done, right? We got here because we were not vigilant. So we've got to, and we need to remember how we got here and who got us here, and prioritize and invest in those Black women and in these Indigenous communities that are on the ground doing this work for next to nothing. So that's my invitation, is to think beyond an election cycle, because it's so easy. I'm celebrating. I was here in Brooklyn with my champagne in the street. Let me tell you, first one. Although I'm still holding some anxiety until we get to January and we see what's going to happen. But I know that we still have a fight ahead. And we still have half of this country who is not on the same side as us. And so we've got to tell our stories. We've got to support the people who are telling the stories. We've got to support building power. And we've got to make space for those bridge conversations to bring folks in, so we can get to a place of healing and unity. And the last thing I'll say is kind of building off of what you said, Abby. I think that this work is so important when we're talking about racial equity, when we're talking about power, beyond the webinars, beyond the workshops. We all need to be obsessed with this. Like, you need to be reading books, you need to be having conversations with your family, you need to be talking about this in your faith communities. If the only time we're talking about race and power is like at a work situation, workshop here and there, it's not enough. We've got to be saturated with this, because it is work that's going to take the rest of our lives and generations to come to like move forward. And so there's nothing that's more important, as far as I'm concerned, for our collective liberation.
That's a great place to end. Thank you both so much. And thanks everybody for joining us. Really appreciate it. Come back December 8th. And if your question was not answered, please, we'll figure out how to get it answered if you need it answered. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a great afternoon.